Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I'll be making a lidded bowl with an interesting finishing technique to achieve that ebonised look. So without further ado, let's get into it. To begin with, I marked out the centre on the timber blank so I could mark out the outer diameter of the bowl, and after I cut the corners off on my bandsaw, I drilled an 8mm hole for the woodworm screw on the lathe. So with a blank fixed to the lathe, I could start turning. I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to remove material to get it to round and balanced. The timber is ash, and with a freshly sharpened gouge it cuts very easily. I tried a number of different cutting techniques to see which one gave the best results, and also to reduce tear out. I knew there was a big crack in the blank when I started, and I had hoped most of it could be turned out, but that wasn't going to be the case, so I decided to remove all the areas with bark, and I would have to deal with the cracked part later on. Before I got too far into the project, I decided to cut the mortise. I marked out an 80mm diameter circle, and I used the 1/4" parting tool to cut the outer edge. Then I flattened what remained of the base before removing the waste material in the recess, also cutting it deeper to around 1/4 inch or 6mm. With the mortise done, I defined the outer edge of the foot and moved on to forming the side of the bowl with a 3/8 bowl gouge. Cutting the mortise and defining the edge of the foot allowed me to cut away a lot of the bark and some of the crack. Whilst doing this, I realised there was a lot more height to the blank, so rather than just a simple bowl design, I began to cut a pedestal base, which I think turned out to be a good decision. Using the gouge, I made a series of cuts on either side of the cutout, getting it roughly to shape and depth. Adding the pedestal base effectively reduces the height of the dish part of the bowl, which, to keep things in proportion, gave me the opportunity to reduce the bowl's overall diameter, thereby removing most of the bark. After reducing the diameter of the bowl, I set to fine-tuning the overall shape of the outside surface, which brought on another slight design tweak. So after a bit of shear scraping to blend and fare the upper part of the bowl, using the 1/4" parting tool, I cut a flat section at the deepest part of the cutout. This on its own didn't look so great, so I softened the sharp edges with a bowl gouge, which looked much better. With the outside more or less done, it was time to deal with a crack, and for that I used Starbond black superglue and an activator to speed up the curing process. It took a few goes to completely fill it, but once it was done, I used a skew chisel to gently remove the excess. The cutout still needed some work. It looked out of proportion after reducing the bowl diameter, so I cut it much deeper using a 1/4" parting tool, cutting a slot a bit wider than the tool width so it wouldn't grab, and when it was at a good depth I used a bowl gouge and the skew chisel to fine tune the surface into the cutout, but they were both a bit big to get to the full depth, so out came a new tool. I think it's referred to as a spindle detailing gouge, but anyway, it was perfect for shaping the inner part. doesn't that look much better? And with a bit more scraping for the gouge and some 80 grit, the outside was finally finished. Well, almost, I think. Just the small nubbins to remove from the mortise, followed by a bit of sanding, and I remounted the bowl on the 4-jaw chuck, ready to start hollowing out the inside. All safe and secure, I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to face off the front of the bowl, then I started to hollow out. With a resharpened gouge, the ash cut incredibly well. I began by forming the rim and removing material from the outer part, working my way into the centre. Once I'd removed most of the inner material, I could see the other side of the crack, and yes, most of the black you can see is Starbond superglue, which had seeped through from the outside. A few more passes with a gouge in the inside was done, so I moved on to forming the lid. The piece of wood for the lid is from some ash I bought a while ago, so there is no chance the grain will match. But as you'll see later, that isn't a problem. I cut the corners off with a bandsaw and clamped it in the coal jaws with a tailstock for extra security. I turned the outer diameter down to something a bit bigger than the bowl, then using a 1/4-inch parting tool, I began forming the cutout to fit into the bowl rim. This took a few goes, and it ended up being a bit slack, but I thought it would be okay, so I moved on to finishing the underside. Whilst doing the underside, I decided to start again with a lid fitment, so I removed the offending piece and redid the cutout, and this time I got a much better fit. Final pass with a bowl gouge, and I sanded from 80 to 320 grit. Followed by clean down with denatured alcohol, then a single application of sanding sealer, which I denude with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Then Yorkshire grit, 1 coat, thoroughly cleaned away with clean paper towel. And to finish, wood wax 22, a single coat, polished off to leave a deep lustre. With the inside of the lid finished, next I remounted the bowl on the 4-jaw chuck, and I put the lid section on top, and used the tailstock to hold it securely in place. So now I could shape the outside of the lid and blend the two pieces together. I used the bowl gouge to remove the excess material, reducing the outer diameter of the lid down to meet the bowl, and at the same time shaping the top into a gentle sweeping dome. Again, the ash was cutting extremely well, and it took no time at all to get the lid roughly to shape. With the majority of the shaping done, I used a skew chisel to blend and fare the surfaces together, taking light cuts, stopping now and then to check I wasn't making the lid too thin on top. And with a final pass over with a skew chisel, the top was done. And then I sanded from 80 to 320 grit. Just one more thing to do, that was to drill a hole to locate the knob. To do this I used blue masking tape to fix the two pieces together, so I could then use the Jacob's chuck with an 8mm drill in the tailstock. Drilling the hole wouldn't exert a lot of pressure on the lid, so I was confident the tape would hold. Next, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then sanding sealer, 2 coats, each one allowed to dry, and then de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Then another slight design tweak. Rather than trying to hide the joint, I decided to add a slight reveal. For this, I used a skew chisel. A quick session of sanding, and then a reapplication of sanding sealer. And with the lid removed, I finished the inside of the bowl with Wood Wax 22, just one coat. Next, a first for me, ebonising the outside of the bowl. For this I used Speedball Indian ink. With the bowl removed from the chuck, I painted a single coat of ink to the underside of the base. You don't need much of this to cover a lot of area. And also for note, this is why I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer. It seals the surface and stops the ink soaking through to the inside face. Once the ink was dry, which doesn't take long, I fixed the bowl back onto the chuck so I could paint the outside. I could have done this on the bench, but having it back on the lathe meant I could turn it around without touching it. The ink covers incredibly well, and it might be possible to do this in just one coat, but I ended up applying a second. One thing I did find was this type of finish shows up every blemish and imperfection in the surface. Not a bad thing, it's just something to consider if you decide to have a go at this on one of your own projects. And with the second coat finished and allowed to dry, I cleaned up the detail reveal where I'd managed to get some of the ink. It just needed a few touches from the skew chisel. Just one final piece to make, the knob for the lid. For this I used African blackwood, and like on one of my previous projects, I decided the shape would be a miniature version of the bowl it would sit on. I began with a spindle gouge, turning it down to the desired diameter, then switching between the skew chisel, spindle gouge and detailing gouge. I gently nibbled away until the shape revealed itself. And with the final touch up from the skew chisel, it was done. I sanded it to a fine finish, cleaned down with denatured alcohol, applied sanding sealer, denibbed with a scotch pad. Next was Yorkshire grit, cleaned away with paper towel. Then to finish, a single coat of wood wax 22. After carefully turning the locating pin down to 8mm, I parted the piece off. Then I applied a single coat of wood wax 22 to the ebonized surface of the bowl. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was a success. None of the Indian ink came off. A little bit of tight bond medium CA to permanently fix the knob to the lid, and it was finished. That's it, another project finished. There was a lot to take in with this episode, but nonetheless I hope you enjoyed it. I had a great time making it, and using the Indian ink is something I will be doing again. I would like to thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, a thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.